No, it's the whole room, which is unfortunate. Yeah, I mean, I'll survive. Hopefully, I'm young enough. Hi, Jack. Cancel. Okay. 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 So good. Welcome everyone, and thank you for coming. I'm just making sure that we are actually on our YouTube channel. Sorry, these are always a nightmare. But I think we are. Why did it not come up that we were? Yeah, we are. Okay, good. Sorry. Right, I've muted YouTube. That's great. So delighted to be with you all tonight. It's always kind of stressful the first night or two getting back into we're in person tonight as well as online. So between people in the Zoom and people on our YouTube channel, there's a lot going on here. So oh God, this thing's not letting me move my slides. Okay, hang on. Sorry, there's a problem with the slides. So that's good that we found that out. Okay, so just to let you know, tonight's slides don't necessarily match the talk because, of course, there were no cameras or nothing at the time during the famine. So I have just kind of general, I should say, photographs of Listowel, you know, the workhouse, some of the areas I'll be talking about, and one or two larger quotes, and then just some general pictures of workhouses and things. So it'll kind of make sense as we go through the town. I want to say we're doing this talk as part of a series that we've started. It's the 175th commemoration of Black 47. You can move a chair if you'd like and come to this side, because this, yeah. And so we are commemorating the 175th anniversary of Black 47, which is obviously was the worst year of the famine. We'll have a number of talks from academics both here in America and at home in Ireland. Our next one after me is Dr. Karen Sonnenlieter from Siena, and she'll be speaking about different efforts at relief works and charity, as well as the public, you know, what the public were doing, the public government, I should say. So my talk is just about the Great Hunger in my hometown of Listowel, which is in southwest Kerry, southwest Ireland in County Kerry, North Kerry. It is typical in one way, and that's why I'm telling the story, because there were several workhouse unions in Kerry. You know, we are not as well known as kind of Skibbereen or any of these other famous stories, but actually what happened in my town is fairly representative of what happened in all of these other towns. And so I think, you know, it's important because it is not unique or not, you know, it's no more tragic or no less tragic than what happened anywhere else. So these will kind of just cycle through, as I say, these slideshows. So the Great Hunger began, of course, in 1845, when successive failures of the potato crop led to approximately 1 million deaths. Another roughly 2 million emigrated to Canada, Australia, America, and England, with many of them dying on the way out or upon arrival. It was the last major famine in Europe, and it changed the face of Ireland, perhaps more than any other event in the country's history. It wipes out an entire social class, changed the land ownership and farming system, and it redefined cultural, linguistic, and political norms. So there's no doubt that Ireland in 1852 was a very different country. Landlords were at the pinnacle of social structures in rural Ireland. They were part of a privileged class with stability and prestige that they absolutely defended and promoted. There was a complicated framework of leasing land from other landlords and subletting, so that not all landlords were actually landowners. And this was known as the middleman system, which might include many levels of land letting. The middleman system, along with the partition of property among all of the sons of a family, and then the habit of issuing long leases, was one of the primary flaws of the pre-famine landholding system. Middlemen could rent land from a landlord and then subdivide it and rent it to any number of individuals, some of whom in turn would rent out or subdivide parts of their package. And this was absolutely true of Kerry and certainly of Listowel. Trinity College Dublin, for instance, owned extensive areas of property in North Kerry, but of course the land was managed by local landlords. Most of our larger proprietors were absentee landlords residing in England or or pursuing other vocations. So Lord Listowel and Sir Edward Denny, whose Denny's had an estate in Tralee, it was about 21,000 acres, were both absentees. And their estates were managed by dedicated resident agents, James Murray Home and William Denny, respectively. In my efforts to understand how the famine upset or affected my hometown and how we responded to this national crisis, I discovered that many of the primary sources were missing, including 3 volumes of the minute books of the Board of Guardians. This was the group of kind of ratepayers, taxpayers and businessmen who administered the relief programs and managed the workhouse. In fact, even the buildings have disappeared, burnt by the Republican Army during the Civil War in 1922. Most of the records kept by the workhouse master and matron were lost with the buildings, and even the parish records are incomplete. Newspapers then proved to be an excellent source of information, although sometimes given to hyperbole, and the Annals of the Presentation Sisters provide an interesting view on the suffering of the local people. I was able to see these records before they were transferred to the Mother Convent in Cork in, I would say, 2004, maybe. The census figures obviously throw some light on the subject, but they are not without inaccuracies, given, we said, the problem of subdividing the land. And Griffith's valuations naturally show changes in land occupancy and land ownership. Another surprising aspect of my research into the Great Hunger in my hometown was the lack of folklore about it. For an event that clearly touched our small community, the population today is probably 4,000 in that urban area. Our own oral tradition is very silent. There are 2 mass graves in the town, one very famously called Townpel Bawn, but the other back in Gale Cemetery. And the site of the workhouse is known to everyone, but there are few surviving stories or testimonies from that time. And it's shocking considering the Board of Guardians list 2,665 deaths during February of 1850 and March 1852 alone. So Disraeli, the Prime Minister of Great Britain and Ireland, said that Ireland was perhaps the most densely populated country in Europe by 1841. The census figures for 1841 show that County Kerry had a population of 293,880. Listowel, a small market town located 9 miles from the Atlantic Ocean, had, and with 75% of the population in rural Listowel living in 4th-class housing. That is 1-room mud cabins or spalpeens on barely a quarter of an acre. So 75% of the population, and this is one of the main streets in my town. These landless cottiers eked out a living with casual agricultural work, using whatever cash they earned to pay the rent on their paltry holdings, while depending on the potato for nourishment, a staple food which could be grown in lazy beds in even bad soil. By 1851, the population of Kerry had decreased to 238,254, which is a loss of 55,000 people, while that of Listowel alone had dropped from 78,863 in 1841 to 61,019 in 1851. So 17,844 people had vanished from an area of 208,000 statute acres, either through death or immigration. There were omens of the coming disaster in Listowel as early as June of 1839. Stephen Edward Collis, who was an agent to Lord Listowel, wrote to the latter about a public meeting of the clergy, gentry and inhabitants of the town, who expressed apprehension at the increasing difficulties of the labouring classes of this district from the enormous price which the commonest provisions have reached. The potato blight, later identified as Phytophytoptera infestans, was first recognised in Kerry in September 1845. The disease had not even yet been named, and people mistakenly believed that it would be alleviated if they just changed how they stored their potatoes. So this meant that next year's crop, seeded from the stalks of this year, was planted while carrying the disease, and the crop silently rotted underground. People in Kerry, as in much of Ireland, were used to going without food often for the summer months because they ran out of potatoes before the autumn harvest. In fact, the Irish Poor Inquiry noted that the number of persons destitute in Ireland for at least 30 weeks of the year was over 2 million. So the failure of this staple crop was to have a disastrous effect on that cottier class. George Nichols was sent to Ireland in 1836 as a poor law commissioner to ascertain Ireland's relief needs. He was a cynical and uncompassionate man who wholeheartedly subscribed to the Victorian view that charity should not necessarily help the poor. He thought the Irish people, quote, feel no pride, are heedless of the present and reckless of the future. Their cabins still continue slovenly, smoky, filthy, almost without furniture or any article of convenience or decency. As part of this philosophy, he ensured that conditions in the workhouses would be just miserable enough to dissuade all but the truly desperate from seeking refuge there. The British government passed the Irish Poor Law Relief Act in 1838, under whose auspices the country was divided into poor law unions, each with its own workhouse. The population then in those workhouses was classified into 5 different groups: males over 15, females over 15, males between 2 and 15, and females between 2 and 15, with children under 2, sometimes allowed to remain with their mother. So families necessarily were separated from each other on entry, often never to be reunited. The workhouse of Listowel was on a 6-acre site and could provide accommodation for 700 people. It was completed in 1842, but did not open the doors for another 3 years because they could not raise the taxes from the local ratepayers. It was finally declared fit to receive paupers on the 13th of February, 1845. And by the end of that year, 826 people were living there. So it's already over capacity. And they opened auxiliary houses in Gunsborough, Tarbert, Bedford, and various buildings throughout the town of Listowel. Reports began to circulate which indicated that conditions in Ireland were a lot worse than had been initially thought. H.N. Greenwell visited Kerry in October of that year. He wrote in his report that, quote, distress is general, and the people are, with few exceptions, in a completely destitute state. The potato has entirely failed, and having grown no grain, the poor are solely dependent for their food upon the importation of Indian meal. Particular care should be taken of this district because, in consequence of its isolated position and the want of general knowledge and intelligence, its inhabitants are less able to resist the present calamity and to adapt themselves to a change of circumstance. On the 21st of October, he wrote, the people will control themselves no longer in many instances. There can be no doubt that very great privations have been and are being suffered by the poor of this country, and great praise is due for the extraordinary temper they have displayed on all occasions, not one case of rioting having occurred during the whole of this trying season. But this was not to remain the case for much longer. In 1846, a Public Works Act was passed which aimed to provide work to those now destitute by the famine. In an open letter published in the Kerry Examiner in September of that year, Labouchere, the chairman of the Board of Public Works, stated that magistrates and cess, or taxpayers, were to provide employment for the people by the execution of useful and reproductive works, with their assistance and the blessings of the Almighty on their united exertion, that the calamity with which it has pleased Providence to afflict Ireland may yet in its results become conducive to the production of a greater abundance of human food from the soil. So with the best will in the world, however, the work usually involved building roads or draining fields, quarrying stone sometimes, which usually coincided nicely with the landlord's decision to renovate his own estate. Tension was rising in Listowel then throughout the year of 1846. One of the major problems in the district was the high population in an area without real opportunities for work and absentee landlords. £7,900 was assigned to provide employment for the people, and as early as January 1846, work had begun on lowering the road from Tralee to Kilflynn and Listowel at £2.10 per perch, and widening and making fences and bridge building. Able-bodied men were hired each morning at a wage of 4 pence a day, although one infamous local landlord, George Sands, paid them only 2 pence a day and their diet. The job they had, this is taken from the Heritage Schools records, the job they had were pulling mangolds, which is a type of turnip or rutabaga, from dawn to dark. The food they had for dinner was meal and mangolds boiled and a drop of sour milk down on that. So they weren't really fed enough to be able to keep up with the physical labor. By Wednesday, the 23rd of September, tempers were fraying as hunger pangs and exhaustion prevented many men from being able to work. Magistrates and ratepayers met in a Listowel courthouse for, quote, the purpose of devising means to give employment to the labouring poor of this barony to meet the distress arising from the failure of the potato crop. Tenants packed the courtroom, while more remained outside, anxiously awaiting the results of the day's proceedings. It was determined at the meeting that there was 2,500 distressed labourers who could now be employed erecting walls and building roads, and that the wages would be 4p each, which elicited loud disapproval. This was the first sign of rebellion amongst the notoriously patient peasantry. The Reverend Father Mahoney, parish priest in Listowel, made, quote, a powerful appeal to the people, urging on them the necessity of conducting themselves patiently and peacefully, to place the most implicit confidence in the gentlemen who were on the bench. The situation seemed to only go from bad to worse in late September and October. An editorial in the Kerry Examiner on the 9th of October lamented the decision to build yet more famine roads, which were at this point called Boher na Marav, which meant Road of the Dead. The country, we fear, will yet sorely feel the consequences of useless road making. Let harbours be constructed. Let pipes laid down for the conveyance of water to every house. These and other works would be more useful and productive. In addition to rumblings against relief works, petty theft had spread up all over the county as sheep were stolen, grain stores raided, and cattle were bled so the liquid could be added to the Indian meal. In October of 1846, a poem appeared in the Kerry Examiner which called on England to aid Ireland in her crisis of gloom. Bread, bread for the fainting and dying, that only can cure. Why send your soldiery over the water? To drive men to madness, collision, and slaughter? Listen, ye proud statesmen, how Erin's fair daughter hangs o'er her harp and laments for her poor. There was obviously a growing sense of unease, and a vague threat hung in the air as desperate men were pushed to their limits. A letter sent to the Kerry Evening Post warned that patience will have its limits in Kerry, as it has had in other places, and it is much better that a sheep should be given freely and generously than that half a dozen should be taken or slaughtered. On Thursday, the 19th of November, a meeting of the presentment sessions for Listowel Union was attended by tenants of Lord Listowel and the other landlords. The work on the relief scheme had still not started because the Board of Works could not release the funds. There's a fascinating example of paternalism and the laissez-faire attitude that the members of ruling classes held over the indignant subjugated people. Mr. Corridon, a tenant of Lord Listowel, represented some of the tenants in the district and explained to the committee that the people were starving and could not wait any longer for the work. Mr. Stokes, Esquire, a local landlord, held the chair, and he reiterated the position that they were waiting for the Board of Works to release the funds and there was nothing he could do until such time as the money came through. Corridon maintained the people needed food, and when he was asked how he thought they could get it, he replied, "Give them work." Stokes responded that that was exactly what the committee was trying to do, and, quote, it would be more becoming of him to reflect on what he was going to say than to be exciting ignorant people when he could suggest no remedy and point out no means for their relief but those already adopted by the gentleman. A writer in the Kerry Evening Post went on to reflect that, quote, there is little doubt that a very foolish combination is existing among the labourers. The people can be easily moulded in their present necessities to any interested or ill-digested representations. These labourers, however, had been starving for the better part of a year, and it now appeared that their cries for help were falling on deaf ears. The labourers' final stand came on the night of Wednesday, the 25th of November, almost a week after that Assembly of Landlords shamed Corridon into silence. The headline in the Kerry Evening Post read, "Alarming assemblage of country people in Listowel threaten attack on the workhouse." According to that account, around 5,000 or 6,000 people shouting bread or blood proceeded in the greatest state of excitement to attack the workhouse. They intended to break into the workhouse on the outskirts of the town because it was known to contain food. Their route took them past the convent of the Presentation Sisters, which had opened 2 years earlier. Father Mahoney, the parish priest, was with the nuns at the time, one of them was his sister, and when he saw the, quote, vast multitude approach, he rushed out and pleaded with them not to do anything rash and to return home. The priest eventually sank down and fainted, and the residents of the neighbourhood appealed to the starving mob. The sight of the priest lying supine before them, coupled with the threats and pleas of the people, had an immediate effect on their minds. They forgot their hunger, assumed sudden calmness, and at length departed quietly. Local lore suggests that many of these people ate prashok or charlock, a type of weed, and died in the ditches on their return home. The article goes on to say that, quote, the poor, unhappy people presented all the appearance of want. Their bodies could scarcely be said to be clothed, and their pallid visages showed what ravages gaunt famine had already made on their health and manly vigour. Heaven only knows where these things are to end, For it is to be feared we have yet scarcely seen even the beginning of the misery that awaits our unhappy people. It's almost inconceivable that these people simply agreed to go home peacefully, but perhaps their lack of energy due to starvation contributed to that. A correspondent wrote to the paper the following week to say the crowds were not as numerous as reported, but the incident is still significant. Even if the numbers were exaggerated, the fact that there was a protest at all, at a time when the passive acceptance of the Irish president had been commented on in the British press, shows how dire the situation had become. It was the only and last such stand in Listowel. The people who protested mostly came from Beale and Kilconnelly, and the changes in that area because of the famine were keenly felt. Land changed hands and some tenants consolidated their farms. According to the Griffith valuations for that year, Flahavan, Flaherty, Ferris and Connors owned only a house, so it is possible that they were among the protesters. Morris O'Connor owned 100 acres. Dalton, Feely, Carmody, Breen, Stack and Sheehan were also large landholders. It must have been terrible for such a small community to watch their neighbours suffer and die, while each household, even those large landowners, barely had enough to keep themselves alive. As with any disaster, there must have been survivor's guilt, especially when one considers that often those who were left alive and behind thrived only because of the deaths or immigration of their neighbours. One section of the community which endeavoured to help the people suffering outside of the auspices of the Relief Committee was the Presentation Convent Sisters. The convent had opened in 1844 and was situated very close to the workhouse. In fact, both of the buildings were separated by merely a field and a stone wall. The convent had an excellent view of Temple Bawn, that became the mass grave, and the road that led from the workhouse to that graveyard. Lord Listowel's agent, Mr. Cheevers, arranged for the letting of the land to the nuns and Father Mahoney, who had preserved for several years in his efforts to open a convent there. The annals of the Presentation Sisters were a very interesting primary source. Handwritten and often very effusive, they are a testament to the women who underwent considerable sacrifice to live as nuns at that time. Of course, the annals are primarily concerned with convent business, but the events of 1845 to 52 had a huge impact even on that small, isolated community. The language used by the scribe is very formal, but kind of Victorian melodrama, especially when she deals with the death of one particularly devout sister. One of the nuns died, as many, people did when they were tending to people who had a famine fever. But of course, they serve as a reliable eyewitness record. And considering the dearth of other evidence, being given access to these annals was very valuable. So 4 young women, headed by Mother Mary Teresa Kelly, established the Order of the Presentation Sisters in Listowel on the 7th of May in 1844. Obviously, these women were from wealthy families. They were educated and had been provided with a dowry for the church. That first evening, they were welcomed to the town by the merchant class, Catholics, in this lovely garden party. Father Mahoney had the house well supplied with creature comforts, the garden tilled and every preparation made for his nuns, so long wished for, so long laboured for. This was a write-up in the newspaper. Aside for exclamations over how fitting the house was and the different plans that the Reverend Mother had for the school and a chapel to be built, the year 1845 closed merely with the comment, nothing of much note occurred. 1846, however, was an entirely different matter. The annals open with, there is much more to be recorded of the year just closed than of the preceding ones. The nuns had spent 18 months collecting money to enlarge the church, and their primary school was thriving. There'll be photographs in a minute of this. There were 500 students registered there, many from the landless cottier class. In fact, education among primary school students had been mandated by the British in Ireland from about the 1830s. It was basically an attempt to teach them English and teach them how to be good British citizens. So there was free primary education in Ireland before there was in England. The situation turned sour quite quickly, though, and it was not long before the effects of the blight became apparent. Quote, great distress prevailed. The all-absorbing thought was what could be done for our poor dear children. The enterprising nuns accepted a suggestion from Miss Raymond, who was the matron of the workhouse, to make undershirts for the paupers of the workhouse, while the older students would get paid for making. According to the annals, the men at the workhouse took forcible possession of the convent basket each time a delivery was made, because the stitching was so much better than shop-bought clothes and did not rip apart. The nuns were pleased they were able to give relief, which is wages, to their students, and that of the most satisfying kind, payment for industry. This did not last long, however, as a scheme because some, quote, wiseacres among the poor law guardians complained that farmers' daughters got work from the nuns, while the poor seamstresses of the town were in great distress. The work was taken from us at the convent. So there's a lot of competition. It appears from the annals that the town seamstresses pawned the material that was given to them to sew, and then the Board of Guardians had to pay them again to re-release it. The board decided that the workhouse would now oversee the sewing of its own shirts, and girls would be brought in and paid a penny a day to sew them. Many of the girls subsequently gave up schooling to work all day at the workhouse, earning less money now than what they had done when the convent paid them. This was probably occurring at the same time that Corridon was trying to ensure the labourers had work, and it is clear that Listowel was in a dire situation, that people were becoming competitive for the very little work that was available. The annals close for the year 1846 with a gloomy outlook. The prospects for the coming year are appalling. May God assist his own poor and help us to relieve our loved children. 1847 was known as Black 47, as deaths reached unprecedented levels due to dysentery and famine fever being spread. The public works scheme was cancelled and soup kitchen services started to dwindle. The convent in Listowel now had 10 nuns who undertook a major appeal of their own friends and families, and the Society of Friends donated a large supply of rice and Indian meal to them. The nuns exchanged this for first quality flour to make bread for the children. Rice wasn't really, they didn't know how to eat it or cook it. A surprise donation from the Mother Superior's brother, Mr. Dan Brennan, who was a merchant in Liverpool, coincided with the gospel reading of the miracle of the loaves and fishes, and Mother Xavier decided that the convent would serve breakfast to 13 children every morning in honour of the Last Supper. The children were given this freshly baked bread with a mug of boiled rice with a little milk in the mug, done to check dysentery, which was fearfully prevalent. The nuns received donations of £80 from a cardinal in Rome, and within a few months, 250 children received daily breakfast. The nuns took their meals in a cell now because the refectory was given over for the use of the children. Quote, the children were called into their meals in groups of 50. They participated of it in silence, the only noise being the clatter of their spoons. A sister either read or told a pious story while the other sisters helped. One child was so weakened from want that she had to be fed only on new milk. We had seen children get a weakness after food and others before their breakfast was ready. Oh, they are awful times. But that it may appear irrelevant to our annals, we could give fearful instances of the effects of the famine, especially those witnessed by our priests. So despite this heart-rending first-hand account, more information is sadly lost, and it's unfortunate that the nuns did not keep records of the deaths and the immigrations that they knew about. Among the social and political repercussions of the famine were those which had their foundations in religious issues. The annals commented a couple of times on the patience of the people, and in an interesting aside, congratulated people on staying faithful to their religion, quote, under the pangs of hunger and despite the disgraceful proselytizing efforts being made. The annalist does not give details of these efforts, but it's worth mentioning that there is also mention of this in the Book of Guardians minutes, noting that visits to the paupers by clergy members from Protestant churches were distrusted by the inmates. Souperism was the name given to the alleged efforts of soup kitchen volunteers and other Protestant clerics to convert Catholics to Protestantism. Asenath Nicholson recorded one exchange she overheard while touring Ireland. "Don't you see now what your idolatry has brought upon you?" handing a starving woman tauntingly a little food. "You've been told that something dreadful will come upon you long before, but you would not believe. Now are you ready to come out of that church?" Beyond the obvious ethics of the matter, the cruelty of such behaviour would in the long run have an undeniable impact on political issues with a religious basis. 1848 proved a difficult year for the convent as their resources were seriously tested, and 2 of the young postulants died from famine fever. By February of that year, their resources, quote, failed altogether. For 12 months, we have fed our poor children. 31,000 breakfasts have been given. Captain Sparks, who had been sent to Listowel in 1847 to report back to the relief commissioners because the union still had problems collecting rates from the taxpayers, noted, and there was also a dispute, about giving outdoor relief to those who would not enter the workhouse. Sparks felt the commission should allow this outdoor relief as, quote, the necessity is urgent, arising from the great extent of the distress already existing throughout the Union. The nuns benefited from his compassion too, as, quote, that kind gentleman was charged with the distribution in this district of the monies given by the Queen of England and English people for the relief of the poor famishing Ireland. He allowed daily rye bread for 400. What a falling off this was from our fine white bread. and rice to absolute black bread, a loaf of which 8, 10, or 12 ounces was given according to the age of the recipient. Bad as was this food, it was eagerly sought out, the postulant noted. The litany of death and disaster sounds almost Dickensian in its descriptions, but it serves to highlight the pathos of the situation. Quote, the bread of the absentees was given to expectants, as we styled them. So, you know, if somebody was missing, the next child in line would get it, even though she hadn't been one of the regular receivers. One of those called out one day, finding that she was overlooked. I am a spectre, ma'am. It was scarcely a misnomer. Famine indeed had done its work on her. So like, it really sounds like, you know, Oliver Twist and the, please sir, may I have some more? But also think of a little peasant child coming in to say, I am a spectre, you know. The misery continued that year as cholera, dysentery, and famine fever spread throughout the community. 2 more nuns died because of the overcrowding in the school, and the breakfast room ensured the disease spread. The Board of Guardians had actually erected a fever hospital on the grounds of the workhouse, and there was also a district fever hospital near the main graveyard in the town. The Workhouse Fever Hospital had 96 inmates in 1848. Mr. Phelan, appointed to inspect the sanitary conditions of the workhouse, reported to the commissioners that, quote, the proper nursing and care of the infants is more or less unsatisfactory, which I would partly attribute to the want of energy on the part of the matron. Several of the infant class are unhealthy and not likely to thrive. They are not particularly clean. Somewhat ironically, in the same report, he continues, it appears to me that the dietary is unnecessarily expensive. Each pauper above 2 years gets 3 ounces of rice with more or less of Indian meal for breakfast. I have suggested that the proportion of rice be reduced to 1/4 of the meal used. That is to make the stirabout of 3 parts of Indian meal, which really wreaked havoc on their stomachs, and 1 part of rice, as the latter is 91 pounds per ton, the former, 19 pounds per ton, the former only 9. The language used by the civil servant is so clinical, but it totally diminishes the horror of the deaths of these children to a point where the reader would actually almost miss it. Having tackled hunger for the children in their schools, the nuns next turned their attention to the clothing of the destitute children. The curate of the parish donated a gold chain, which had been presented to him by a gentrified lady. He suggested sending £2 of tickets to some of the drapers of the town to sell, with the understanding that the value, if disposed of, would be taken from them in material. This plan succeeded admirably, and we were able to distribute £10 worth of clothing among the most needy of our children. 1848 was the last year that the nuns kept detailed records pertinent to the famine and their efforts, but the crisis was far from over. The rest of the clergy were very active in the Listowel area and championed the people's causes, whether it was protesting evictions or ensuring that labourers got paid for their work in timely fashions. The priests in Ballybunion and Ratu and Ballyhaig were very vocal and constantly wrote to the newspapers or the poor law commissioners if they needed to, and they did not mince their words. In a letter to the Nation newspaper in 1850, Father McMahon of Ballybunion wrote, despair of maintaining themselves and their destitute families in this unfortunate country had seized them and turned their attention to the free and flourishing shores of America, where away from the extermination and plunderers created and sustained by the infernal policy of England, they make sure of having full security for their lives and a certain reward for their industry. Within the past 2 years, 36 families were evicted by Mr. Meade Dennis. Within the past 18 months or so, Mr. Hartnett evicted 32 families. Last November, Mr. Blacker demolished a village of 20 houses and sent the inhabitants adrift. A month ago, 26 families comprising 120 souls were evicted from Ballybunion and 35 families of 160 souls from Killahaney. When oppressed with the ennui of high life, desolated homesteads, shrieking widows, screaming orphans, groaning invalids, broken-hearted wretches and pale-faced starvelings will form a refreshing picture for these absentee landlords' contemplation. Nor did Father McMahon spare the workhouse, and the Listowel workhouse served all of these, committees. The next one was in Tralee, which was 17 miles away. Dingle didn't get one until about 1850. Among all the workhouses in Ireland, the Listowel one enjoys an inglorious preeminence. A ticket of admission is to be regarded as a passport to eternity. The tottering gate, emaciated frames, and the livid countenances of the poor creatures truly evince the direct destitution. The truth is they are crammed into pest houses in order that they may perish and taxation diminish. Such then is the state of this locality. It may be compressed in these 4 words: extermination, emigration, hunger, and proselytism. Life in the workhouse resembled that of prison dormitories to an extent, because rules for behaviour were very strict and socialising was regimented and observed. Normally, to be honest, not even allowed. There was a roll call every morning and paupers were inspected to ensure cleanliness. Inspector Phelan reported to the commissioners in Dublin in 1848 of Listowel that the house, yards and grounds are in a very uncleanly slate. The latter at the rear and sides are impassable on foot from mud and water lodged along the passage. The discipline of the house is very imperfect. The master is very young and has not been long in office. The matron appears to be physically and mentally incapable. Both have succeeded others under whose management the house was very badly conducted. The house is always in moist weather, in a wet and dirty state, as are the paupers. One can only imagine the miserable conditions that existed in the workhouse, and coupled with the segregation of families, that must have been almost unbearable. In fact, the fear and hatred felt towards the workhouse at that time is probably one of the main aspects of the famine that remained in popular consciousness. De Valera, who was Prime Minister of Ireland throughout the 30s and 40s, insisted that many of the buildings be torn down rather than remain as a, quote, blemish on the landscape, and a testament to the suffering of the Irish people at the hands of a cruel foreign government. Some of the buildings were converted into hospitals or local government buildings before this order, and there were two at least preserved in their entirety, the Strokestown Famine Museum in Roscommon and Donamore Workhouse at Borris and Ossory. In Listowel, all that remains of the workhouse has been incorporated into the hospital and its chapel and part of the boundary walls. So this is the convent that the nuns lived in. Initially just this building, the chapel was built a few years later, and then this is the primary school building on the other side. But still a huge house for 4 women. Yeah. So they would have fed the kids in this long building on the side. Conditions in the workhouse remained miserable for the 7 years of the famine and after it. As early as 1847, the medical officer reported that there was a great increase of disease in the infirmary, no less than 29 cases of fever, 27 measles, and of smallpox 3. Not a moment should be lost to prevent the direful spread of disease among the inmates of the workhouse, causing suffering and disease among the pauper inmates. The contractor for milk has failed to supply that article to the amount of 50 gallons daily, unnoticed. So farmers, were not kind of keeping up their end of the bargain. We have seen that by March of 1850, as many as 50 people die each week. Whiskey was often the only form of pain relief available, and indeed Dr. Thorpe and Dr. Enright ordered gallons of whiskey each week to serve to the patients in the form of punch. So folk memory of famine burials does exist in Listowel, as it does in every town in Ireland. There are roads and fields called after the Indian meal that people were given to eat as part of the relief schemes, as well as where they huddled to hear mass at the auxiliary workhouses, and the road to Temple Bawn, which is Little White Temple, from the workhouse was called the Black Road or An Bóthar Dubh. The Shannon Side Annual of 1959, a local magazine, described the process of the mass burials. In the famine times, they were dying by the horse load, and old Tom the Dead used to be transferring coffins with a horse and cart. He'd have them stretched in the car and he'd put a few coffins across them and a few more on top of them. And he used to say sometimes it wasn't worth his while going off with the load till he'd have another corpse. They died of sickness and hunger. Other accounts suggest that bodies were buried in canvas sacks and with the use of a hinged coffin so that the body could be dumped into the pit and the coffin reused. With approximately 40 deaths a week in the Listowel workhouse, this seems plausible if horrifying. For the people who did not receive relief, either because they refused to enter the workhouse or because they had been means tested and not found needy enough, crime became their only chance for survival. The courtroom in Listowel had never been busier, as the occurrences of sheep stealing, larceny and shipwrecking increased drastically. John Locke travelled through Kerry and Limerick as a valuer for the commission, recorded in his diary revolution in France, and from the widespread misery and dissatisfied feelings of the popish peasantry and priests in Ireland, do not think it unlikely that some revolutionary movement will be attempted at home. While it did not, surprisingly, reach those epic proportions, crime escalated as the thought of transportation was no longer seen as a threat, but was recognised as salvation of sorts. And if the offender was only to be put in prison, at least he would be guaranteed a meal and shelter. However, jails themselves soon resembled the workhouses in that they became overcrowded, and dysentery and cholera spread quickly through the inmates, many of them dying before they could even be sentenced. The numbers for Listowel Court increased from only 2 crimes, one of perjury and one of larceny in 1845, to 30 instances in 1849. Crimes were more regularly committed by men than by women, and the ages of the thieves run from 15 years of age Thomas Nelligan, who was accused with John Nelligan, age 22, of sheep stealing, both sentenced to transportation to Australia for 10 years, to 60-year-old John Walsh, accused of perjury and sentenced to transportation for 7 years. Most of those found guilty of sheep or cow stealing were transported. 3 of the Listowel inmates died in hospital in May 1847. Another died in jail in April. They had all been convicted of stealing. 2 more inmates died in hospital in 1849. So this is the burial graveyard. It's across the road today from the workhouse. It's called Templebone. The famine remained in Listowel until about 1852, really, although the last potato blight occurred in 1850. It affected Listowel as it did every small town on the western coast of Ireland, but it's impossible to go into all the different aspects of such a huge topic in a paper of this size. Like any drama, it has its heroes and villains. In actuality, however, it really was an unprecedented disaster, and there was probably little that anyone could do given the structural disadvantages and kind of laziness that surrounded it. Officials and civil servants whose endless bureaucracy sounds heartless sometimes did the best they could under difficult circumstances. Rates and taxes were not paid. The government did not always contribute the funds they should have. The population were landless and helpless in general. The efforts of the clergy, the nuns, a few local shopkeepers and farmers are still remembered in our town, as are the misdeeds of some of the most heartless and notorious landlords. But the most striking element of my research into the famine has been the silence that surrounds it. Skibbereen, Ballinrobe and Kilrush are famous centres of famine disaster in Ireland, and yet the statistics appear to suggest that Listowel suffered almost as much as these towns. There was perhaps an effort made among the survivors and their descendants to try to eradicate the memories of the Great Famine. A reporter to the Irish Folklore Commission, in an attempt to collect data in 1945 from primary school children and their families, wrote, "It seems there was a sort of conspiracy of silence on the part of their fathers and mothers about it all. The monuments at Templebone, and Gale Cemetery go some way to honouring the dead of our town, and lately local historians have been publishing excellent books on the subject." I should say, when I was doing this research in 2004, I did it because I was out for dinner with my parents and a group of their friends. I was teaching in, 2008. I was teaching in Dubai. And one of the older men, I ordered lobster, and one of them said, "I can't believe you eat that. It's famine food." And I was like, "Wow, it's, lobster claws are expensive today, guy." And I asked him, would he tell me some stories? And he more or less refused to tell me. He told me that his grandmother called lobster and crab and mussels, all that cheap shellfish, famine food, but otherwise he didn't want to talk to me about it. And he actually said, "Why do you want to hear about that terrible stuff, Gerline?" which is young girl. So I had to go to the library and look up the papers because it was so impossible to hear stories. I know my own ancestor was on the board of guardians, one of the stacks. They owned drapery stores and furniture stores in our town. So it's a mixed, we come from a mixed family, I suppose, that might have been on the wrong side, seen to be on the wrong side of this particular debacle. So last slide, by 1851, there was 1 million Irish in the United States, 750,000 in Britain. Oh, good. 250,000 in Canada, 70,000 in Australia, and others in Central and South America. If the famine changed the face of Ireland, then it also changed the face of the world. The famine was to remain in Ireland for another 5 years, but by 1846, just 1 year into it, hunger had already devastated our small community in Listowel. The figures for deaths between 1846 and 1850, particularly in the workhouse, have been lost, but it's reasonable to suggest that they were at least as high as the figure for 1850 to 1852, which is 2,665, just from the workhouse. Of the thousands of dead buried in this unmarked, today marked, mass graves, without a coffin or the benefit of a proper funeral service, we know the names of only 3 people: Muireann, the dancer, Paddy the Goshk, which means jockey, and Buckley the fiddler. And I think it's amazing that all 3 of these people are known by their talent or their connection to culture and art. It's amazing. There are commemorative plaques written in Irish at Gale Cemetery, which was used also as a mass grave until 1850. Although there are stories of people removing their loved ones from this grave and bringing it to Gale because at least that was proper consecrated ground. And Templebone has this monument. The Gale Cemetery Memorial translates as "to the memory of, we must not forget them." So that's the end of that talk. If anyone has any questions, I'll try and steer through them here. Just somebody, Liam, would you mind turning on the light? You know, thank you. It's the one right inside the door, the main door. So does anyone have on the left? Anyone, any got questions or comments?
I'm sort of unclear about what happened when the landlords were given the responsibility to feed the people. That was after the soup kitchens, right? Or was it before?
They kind of coincided. So initially the outdoor relief work was supposed to feed the people, but by giving them this work. So the landlords were supposed to pay their taxes, and then this central fund, you know, would fund the wages for the people. Now, in the first year of the famine, the government actually gave food away gratis in 1846, but that stopped. That was sort of too successful. So there's two different things. There was the work scheme where like you had to work and you got your food, or they were these open soup kitchens that the government ran that were very successful, but they closed those down. And then you have a hodgepodge of, you know, the Quakers, different private facilities opening soup kitchens as just pure charity, like people could come. Now, there was instances where sometimes run by Protestants, you know, you had to convert, or you had to at least pretend to convert. But all of these schemes kind of interact, you know. Certainly the government food is finished by 1846, early 1847.
Okay, so it was more like the landlords paid
the government.
taxes,
Yeah.
and then the government gave food that wasn't direct.
Exactly,
Okay,
yeah.
And then
now, can I just say, some landlords did though, you know, so there's cases of landlords who bankrupt themselves trying to feed their tenants. You know, they don't charge rent for a couple of years. So, you know, there are good tenants, but or landlords, but few and far between. So like one of the main ones in Kerry was the guy in Kenmare, what was his name? Palmerston, I think, or Shelburne. He evicts his entire estate out practically to 5 points. Clears, you know, over 1,000 people from the land, because then they can readjust their land and, you know, go to pasture instead of tillage and all this kind of stuff.
Okay, and my other question was the potato famine or blight pretty much evenly spread across all of Ireland, or did it hit some places worse?
I think the blight was probably widespread and across Europe too. What changed was how dependent the population around the potato. So like if if there's a potato blight in maybe Dublin, like they don't mind as much. Obviously people are not farming as much in Dublin, but they have access to other food. Like, you know, even my hometown, we're 9 miles from the Atlantic Ocean. We have a huge river, the field fish, but people had pawned their boats or their nets, or the landlord owned the fishing rights to the river, so you weren't allowed fish anyway. So like, you know, there are alternative sources of food. Butter, for instance, in all of these Kerry paper, butter and bacon were at huge prices, you know, because but you couldn't afford to, you know, eat the food you were growing because you had to pay your rent, you know. So there's, you know, it is a misnomer to call it a famine simply because there is food. It was the dependency on the potato was the issue,
right?
You know. So the blight is everywhere. It's in Europe, you know, but Ireland, when Irish soldiers joined the British army to fight, in the Napoleonic Wars, the Irish soldiers were taller than the English or French because the potato was nicely nutritious, you know. So they were very fertile. They're having 12 or 14 kids. You know, they weren't dependent on wheat, but this is a problem then. You know. Any other questions or comments? Carol?
I'm a little confused by the fact that this famine caused such a mass migration. And the reason, I mean, of course, if you would say, well, why would that be confusing? For fleeing from the devastated area. But the confusion is that it would seem that people were so destitute. How did they have the money to go?
Yeah. So the question is, how do they have the means to go? And sometimes I just mentioned the Lord Mayor or the Lord of Kenmare and the guy in Sligo, Palmerston does the same thing. Sometimes the landlords, it was cheaper for them, imagine, to pay per ticket per head than it was to pay, because they were taxed per head. So if they have, 1,000 of their tenants are going into the workhouse in Listowel or Galway or wherever, they have to pay to keep those people alive in the workhouse. That can go on for 5 years if they're keeping them alive, And so easier, put them on a ship. You just have to pay one time and they're gone. So many landlords paid to go. There was a lot of charity set up. Of course, the Irish are in America, for already 50 years by then, more. So there were people in Albany and New York and Boston sending money home. It was quite cheap to go to Canada because it was part of the British Empire. So you could scrounge, like they would sell everything. Like there's reports of immigrants getting off the boats practically naked, and then they would walk down from Canada if they survived the crossing. We know Gross Eel, had terrible outbreaks of famine. So help from here, help from the church. It was always nice to be transported. If you were a criminal, that was free. And then in the 1847 era, Lord Earl Grey, him of the tea, started this kind of scheme where they would take women out of the workhouses and send them to Australia to be workers and or wives for the penal colony, who were kind of timing out of their sentences, and to try to stay in Australia and populate it. So at least 15 girls from the Listowel workhouse, for instance, some as young as 15, and one of them, a Mulvihill, which is my mother's people, were chosen. They were given 2 dresses, a pair of shoes and a Bible, and put on board a ship for Australia. So there was many, different ways of leaving. A lot of them, to be honest, you make it as far as England. That might be as far as you go, but I think a lot of people would have had maybe contacts here in America that were able to bring them out of it. And you can see that in letters, please take us out, but, we need you to send money home. So there was a lot of charity relief from here with, the Sons of Friendly St. Patrick and all that kind of stuff. Friendly Sons of St. Patrick. Yeah, even the Hibernians probably too. Yeah.
So I have a question that follows up on both your comment about famine food, also you said about farming ships and things like that. So given all of that and sort of that like mixed bag, was proximity to the Atlantic at all a protective factor against mass starvation, or does it really just depend? Or another way to ask that, I guess, is the further inland where mortality rates from hunger are higher, or is that not the case?
I think definitely proximity helps. Like there's little pockets in sparks, those reports that I was reading from Dublin, like parts of, we'll say, Causeway and the Kerry head coast did not get blight. There's instances that maybe some of the islands didn't have the blight, the Aran Islands and the Blasket Islands. If they couldn't get access to fish, they ate seaweed, which was very nutritious, So there's definitely, they have options. I mean, you can always poach, if the worst comes to the worst. It seems that the deaths are concentrated for all of the counties where the workhouse is. And so like my hometown, our town is small, like you saw the streets, it's 4 or 5 streets, but it's a huge farming hinterland. And so it's those people coming in, as they do in Dingle, as they do in, Galway, like there's a workhouse out in Clifton. It's the packing them in is what I think, so the death figures are probably skewed to make it look like it's worse in urban centers, when actually what it is a depopulation of the rural area completely, either through death or moving. Yeah. Any other question? Liam?
Why many Irish people fish? Goes back to the comment that someone you met made, and I think that the mountain down in Kerry, the farmers.
Yeah.
And they're near the ocean, but they just not something they did.
Yeah.
But I assume they had to do with proximity. They couldn't get to, which is consistent with your question, right? Proximity to the water, but also fishing rights, not having equipment.
Yeah, a lot of Irish, particularly fishermen, yeah.
I don't know if there's any more to that.
There easily could be. So the question for those online was, just like why people didn't fish more or go, into rivers and or the sea more. So, and you're right, I think farming was a particular set of skills, like it's good land in Kerry, but there's always work to be done. You have to be, hoeing and ploughing and pulling up weeds and, repairing a fence. You might have 1 or 2 animals that need to be tended to. So it's not, they were busy because they really don't have, you have a lot of kids maybe, but not a lot of adults, helping. So, it takes, and of course, not much machinery or anything. So it's a lot of heavy work. You got to go to the bog. That's a process. You have to cut the turf, then stack it and let it dry, and then, change it around and bring it home. So all of these, it's labor intensive to farm, you know, in Ireland in those days. So you're right, there probably wasn't the time or the inclination, you know, to get into a boat. And I still think one of the big detractors like would have been the landlord, you know, like maybe you could have a lobster pot or something that you could kind of sneakily check, but you don't have time to sit out all day in a boat, you know, and you could be seen all day in a boat, you know. So maybe trout fishing at night in the river you'd get away with, you know, but you have to be careful. And there are instances near us, like in Finnewick and Listowel, of poachers being killed, you know, by landlords, estates and agents, you know, who monitor what's happening, even for a rabbit, not to mind a fish, you know. So yeah. So does anyone, I'm just going to check online if they had questions, but I think they're all lovely and quiet. Jack, if you have a question, you can, you know, unmute yourself there on Zoom. Anyone else? Yeah, Kathy, did you have your hand up? Oh no, Jack, sorry, was yours. Yeah.
All Irish, but half of them are all famine Irish. There's others came a little bit before that.
Yeah.
Big difference in how they survive.
Yeah.
The later ones did very poorly.
Huh.
It would take 1 or 2 generations before they recover.
Mm-hmm.
They had the Irish group Young People from Concern, which is an Irish famine charity that's all over the world, particularly in the third world.
Mm-hmm.
And they gave a talk out of Siena College, I think it was in 1945, or pardon me, 1995. And they were saying that you think that we're Irish, we know all about this, and you don't, because you weren't there. Some of us know less than you. And it was only recently that time had gone by that people would start dedicating these potter steels that had nothing to indicate they were anything more than lawns. And they mentioned that back in 1925, you had the Free State then, it was a form of independence. You could speak without too much guilt. And they decided, let's go, and I think it was the Folklore Commission, and we'll get to people, not necessarily survivors, most of them have died off, but certainly their children would have memories of the famine. And only 2,500 people were willing to cooperate with the memories. Like the fellow that you mentioned, he said something and almost was sorry he'd said it and didn't want to. And it was a question, when you were back in Ireland, you were obviously descendants of a survivor. And why were you a survivor? Survivor's guilt. Did we deny food to our next door neighbor? Did we steal food? Should we have done something we didn't do? And so the correct thing to do is nothing and don't talk about it. And a lot of history of slavery in America, a lot is written much, much later by the grandparents. The number of books on the famine are nil up until, not nil, but very few.
Very few, yeah. Or they're very Fenian, you know, Fenian, like it's, you know, the British did it and it was genocide, you know,
And the Great Hunger was the first one that I read.
Cecil Woodham Smith,
62 or
Yeah.
so. And that was fabulous, and it was became a foundation for all the ones that followed. The ones that have come after 95, we could talk about it much more openly because we were the great-grandchildren of or even later than that. It's a lot easier to talk about it. It was much more painful.
Oh yeah.
Even when they sent young people who were bilingual and native Irish speakers, nobody wanted to talk about it, and that was in 25 when that was another commemoration year.
Yeah, so Jack was just saying, you know, the lack of education, kind of an acknowledgement in Ireland about the famine, whether it was, you know, because of survivor's guilt. And I definitely think that, I mean, you know, it was kind of shocking to read the Board of Guardian minutes, and I didn't go into all of it here, but I mean, my ancestor is not quoted, you know, he goes to all the meetings, they signed the book. But, you know, in that time, like one of the notes from one of the matrons that was running it was that she had to discipline yet again a little 5-year-old boy because he ran from the boys' dorm to the girls' room to sleep with his sister. So like she, you know, she punished him physically. At least one child, a 2-year-old, they had those huge soup pots, you know, up at the top of the room, in the dining room of the workhouse. At least one child pulled that over on herself and scalded or drowned to death trying to get at the food. So, and like, you know, even I did read today how not into management, like one of the matrons got pregnant by the master and they ran off together. Like, it was horrific, you know. So, yeah, like, you know, did my ancestors who owned a lot of property in the town and continue to do so for, you know, another 100 years, where were they at? Like, how much private charity did they give? And some of that is recorded, so we know they did well. But I think the other side of that is what I was talking about at the start, the absolute overpopulation, you know. And so, in fact, a lot of middle class people, as we would call them, were not really affected because, again, it wasn't a famine. There was just no potatoes. So if you could eat other food, you know, and if you could afford to buy other food, you were fine. So what we are losing is those children, you know, that grew up in houses of 12 people, you know, that's who you lost, these nameless kind of cottier class. And I think anyone, to kind of Carol's point, a lot of the people who emigrated could afford to emigrate. You know, it coincided with the bad timing, but actually a lot of them could afford to emigrate and there was more opportunity abroad. And so, you know, Ireland was incredibly like backward, you know, in one way. Now, the other thing, Jack, not only was there survivor guilt, I will say, you know, when I was in primary school, elementary school, we were brought to this famine graveyard at least once a year. You know, you did a decade of the rosary and you kind of thought about the famine. It was terrible. So we did learn about the famine, you know, when I was up to 12, but then it stops. Literally the history syllabus in Ireland stopped. I think we kind of did, you know, early modern stuff, and then it goes to the coming of the railroad, and then there's a kind of a gap, and then it starts up again in 1860-ish with maybe even 1870, actually, I think was officially 1870, and that's the Land Acts and all, because, of course, I grew up during the Troubles. So, like, we didn't need any more anti-British, you know, propaganda, and you're right, most of the books, you know, before that time, aside from Cecil Woodham Smith's kind of big Bible, were, you know, we hate Trevelyan, the British sent the blight, you know, like all of these kind of comments that were one-off. And so it's only recently with, you know, Christine Keneally and Cormac O'Grady and Ciarán Riley that, you know, there's fantastic work coming out on this, A, using data, but B, you know, complicating the story, that like it was not just the British who were all terrible. It was not just, you know, a genocide, because maybe there was no murderous intent. They might just have been, you know, a huge machinery of government that were horrific, you know. And so, and I mean, the population has never gone back. If we were 8 million in 1841, we're only today 5 million. In the last 3 or 4 years, we've, you know, surpassed the 4 million that we were kind of stuck at. It was 3.5 for a lot of my childhood. Now, that's not including the 6 counties. Don't you love the complications of Ireland, you know? but 5 million, like, we've never gone back to 8 million, you know? And maybe we can't. We see already the overcrowding in Dublin. Like, I don't know if the country has it in it to sustain a population that size, you know? So I'm not saying at all that the famine was needed, but, you know, it certainly made it easier for people who were left behind. And, you know, it bankrupts a certain class of landlords. It starts all those land acts. So people start to buy the disencumbered estates. You know, the British government give loans to tenants to buy the land. So it transformed the country in good ways too, you know. And it killed a lot of Irish speakers, absolutely. Well, for sure, after this, English is seen as the language of opportunity, you know, like they tried, you know, I should be more objective. There was a movement, there were attempts to, you know, with the penal laws and everything, to ban Irish, but it had survived all of that. And so from now on, English is seen as progress. And, you know, we're going to be going anyway to America or England or Australia. We better learn to speak the language. And as I said, the schools, the national school system had been enacted in the 1830s. So, you know, if you wanted to be given your child a chance, Irish was not seen as necessary or helpful until later on, when it was kind of commandeered by the nationalist movement as, you know, a cultural nationalism. Yeah.
How do you spell that? Cottier?
Cottier, C-O-T-T-I-E-R.
What is the actual definition of that?
They were basically landless, so they built a cottage, you know, yeah, like they might have had an acre, but it was subdivided and subdivided, you know. So the English had primogeniture and we did not. And that was actually a holdover from the penal laws too. Every child got a little bit of his father's land. And so, you know, Irish people marry young in those days. This all changed too after the famine. Marriage patterns completely changed. We marry young, very healthy and very fertile, and, you know, you're raising 12 kids on this patch And then next year, or, in 10 years' time, those 12 people are raising, so that's what
Yeah.
happened. So even the census figures might be wrong, because like there's glens and mountains and forests that who knows who was living in them,
Hmm.
But Carol?
I'm sorry, you talk about population. What was the population pre-famine?
Just over 8 million. It was the most densely populated country in Europe, which is, shocking when you think,
Yeah,
yeah.
and now it's about 5.
We just recently, again, I came up just above the 5 million.
That's not including Northern
So Northern Ireland is maybe another million and a bit, but yeah, 1.5 million, yeah. Mm. I know, right?
Ireland and Northern Ireland together are outside.
Yeah. I forget which state. We're half of one of the states or something here. It's a tiny country, punches way above its weight though.
Hidden island,
Oh yeah,
if you were not a legal
tenant.
your relatives were keeping you like the valley of mine.
Yeah.
That they were not all counted.
Oh, absolutely not. Yeah.
8.1 is the official.
Yeah. It could easily be 9.
For another 5 years. or so.
And like people, were in Irish, maybe they didn't know how many kids they had, or, not that they knew, but they didn't tell them all, in one of the census, I think it's 1910, the descendant of that guy who was a ratepayer, they were, they enumerated who was in their household that night, and the sons were all described as scholars, even though like there were 12, so they're not scholars, they're students, pupils. But it came to the daughter, and I think she was about 16 or 15 or something, and under occupation, it said for her, does as she pleases. I was like, I think I'm definitely related to her. So yeah, her poor father or whoever filled out the census. So if no one has any other questions, I just want to give a quick rundown because we have a ton of stuff happening this month. So I want to, as I said, Karen's son Alita will continue this season, this series. She's in about 2 weeks' time with the official kind of charity and all of that. Tomorrow I'm online with the Fulton County Historical Society talking about the Irish in the Mohawk and Hudson Valleys. On Monday 12th, we have our film club back, which is the Irish Pub. On Friday 16th, I'm really excited. We have an Irish-American actor and comedian who will be here in the theatre. His show, Kevin Flynn is his name, and his show is called Fear of Heights, a very funny phobia. And his grandfather was one of the men on that iconic, scaffolding beam eating their lunch above. Yeah. So he's going to talk about what it was like to grow up in an Irish-American family. Karen is here on 21st of September, which is a Wednesday. And then on that Friday, the 23rd, we have Mairead Doherty from Boston by way of Ireland. She's got a harp show, so she'll talk about the history of the harp and the different kind of musicians and tunes, and she'll play that. And then on Wednesday 28th, we have John Joe McGinley, who will talk about the Irish Wise Guys. That's online. And then on the 29th, I'm here with Cherry Hill, and they have a series about the Gilded Age in Albany, and I'll be giving a talk about labor, learning and politics during Irish Gilded Age Albany. So loads coming up, and you're all welcome. We'd love if the people on YouTube would like and subscribe and all that jazz. It's all very, involved now when you've got these online channels. But don't forget, we are open. We'll be soon displaying our new exhibition, which is bilingual, our first ever English and Gaelic, I can't even talk, English and Irish exhibit on James Connolly in Troy. So that'll be up in the next week. And thank you all for tuning in. We're delighted to have you. Check out Facebook and our website for information. So thanks and good night.
Thank you.